Okay, so hi everyone, and I'm Gili Kugler from Sydney University, and thank you for coming. We just had a nice tour at the rare book section downstairs, and it's just a first exposure for those those like me that haven't been there to see what the university has, and if you want to do some further things with them in the future. Those that haven't been there and want to have it again, we can do it sometime in one of the next FPS meetings. So I'm happy to, actually, just before I introduce David, and maybe you can give it to everyone. First, now, this time, I won't forget to ask if anyone wants to say something, share something about publications, new things that were, other way to say it, were published, or anything about scholarship in Australia or New South Wales.
I want to say something. I am not responsible, but there is a book that has been published, and the author is Dr. Gili Kugler.
Okay, no, this has been mentioned already.
It was not mentioned already. I was here at the last meeting and not a word was said.
I should have. Okay, thank you. Any other things? Yeah, you always have something to say if someone else does. I trust you to come up with
I can make up a few publications.
or things that you want to, you'd like to be published. We'll let you get away with it this time. So I'll introduce David Frankel. For me, he's David. I know him quite a lot of years, and I think it's very nice and exciting that we have this encounter here again in Sydney. From the National Library in Jerusalem, actually, we used to sit next to each other. If someone has ever been there, maybe you know that each scholar or PhD student has their place there, and spots are not changeable. This National Library, although they change and it's becoming more modern, and they introduced the computer to the way of finding books, still people hold their spots, and things are quite conservative there. So I knew where to find him every time I wanted. And my actually encounter with him in the first place was via his book, the stories of murmuring stories in the wilderness, which is a huge engagement with the stories of the books of Exodus and Numbers. When I first saw it, I was overwhelmed by the way how many things are to be analyzed there. I remember all the colors, first in your first edition and later in the book. But more and more when I got into the things, I think he, as I said to David, he's the second person that is mentioned in my book after Velaz, so it's something like that, which is such a compliment. But okay, yes. So David is a lecturer, senior lecturer at Schechter, which is Schechter Institution for Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, and he had just recently, a few years ago, another book about the land of Israel and theology. And what's the full title?
The Land of Canaan and the Destiny of Israel.
Destiny of Israel. And we're going to hear something, one glance to your work about texts and theology. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gili. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. What I would like to do in the next while is offer an analysis, somewhat original analysis of the story of the binding of Isaac, the story that's referred to as in Hebrew as the Akedah, the binding which has a tremendous amount of impact on Jewish theology, Christian theology, and just world, culture, to try and understand how it developed and what its meaning might be. And the approach that I am taking is what people refer to as the supplementary approach. In other words, whereas some scholars are focused on dividing text between J and E and P, and everybody knows about that, the documentary approach. This approach that I'm going to try and promote here is more focused on how a specific text grows. So that when you have difficulties within a text, you don't divide it between two different stories, between J and P or J and E, but rather the approach sees an early story or an early text and then supplements or additions which have a certain theological purpose, an agenda. And then you can talk about what the agenda or the theology behind the original text was and why that was seen as problematic, and then what is the purpose or agenda or theology of the final text, which has to be read then as a whole rather than just the addition. In other words, the addition is coming in with the earlier text in mind in order to create a new whole creation. So, so that's more or less the approach that I want to take with the Akedah story, with the story of the binding of Isaac. And I'm going to try and do it kind of like quickly so that we can have time for discussion. We'll see how successful I am. The first thing that I want to mention is the issue of child sacrifice, because obviously somehow the story of the binding of Isaac is related to child sacrifice, whether we refer to it as firstborn sacrifice, because the child is said to be your only son, and only son means the firstborn, or general child sacrifice, because sometimes it wasn't necessarily the firstborn that was sacrificed, or so how does this story fit in with the general institution of child sacrifice? And here there is more or less a kind of consensus in a lot of scholarship and a lot of writing about this story. And the more or less consensus opinion is that the story, or it's a consensus, it has been a consensus until more recently, is that the story in one way or another reflects or expresses opposition of some sort to child sacrifice. And this is based on, first of all, on the fact that the Bible as a whole is very clearly opposed to child sacrifice. It refers to it as an abomination. It refers to it as the typical abomination of the Canaanites in particular. And it is seen as, or described as, the abomination which explains why the Canaanites, lost their right to the land. Like, how is it that the Israelites can just come and take somebody's land? The Bible was disturbed by that problem. And the answer that many passages gave was, well, they're just, they're such an abominable people. They sacrifice their children. That's how abominable they are. Okay, and you've got, I made a handout here, and I'm not going to go through it, but there are a whole bunch of texts, mostly from Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and other places, that harp on this idea that child sacrifice is a Canaanite abomination, and the Israelites must not do that. That's a Canaanite thing. That's an abomination. The Lord detests it. Well, if the Lord detests it, then why is he commanding Abraham to do that? And the answer that is usually given is that somehow this story is another way of teaching that God finds this to be an abomination. In other words, even though there's, as we're going to see, this is like somewhat of a stretch, the general theological and exegetical approach is to say that this teaches us that God does not want child sacrifice. In other words, the emphasis in the interpretation is on the don't put your hand out. I can only say it in Hebrew because it's Al tishlach yadcha anar v'al taslo me'uma. Don't sacrifice the child. Now I know that you are a God-fearing person. And what does he do? He sacrifices an animal instead. And this comes to teach us all that God does not want human sacrifice, but rather human sacrifice should always be suppressed and supplanted via an animal sacrifice, which comes in lieu of child sacrifice. So that's the typical approach. And on your sheet, I brought one of many different quotes that I could have brought from a scholar, in this case an Israeli scholar by the name of Yaira Amit, who says more or less that this is, I'm just going to read the book print in bold, that this is an indirect polemic against human sacrifice. And the story teaches that sacrifices are to be taken from the flock and the herd. Human sacrifice was a one-time command given in extenuating circumstances, given only as a test that was not meant to be carried out. In other words, the point is, it was just a test. God didn't really want it when, he just wanted to see if Abraham had the sufficient faith, but he doesn't approve of child sacrifice, and that's why he stopped it. And that was the only time he commanded it, just that one time, only as a test, and it was the first and last time. Okay. However, there are lots of problems with this approach. Perhaps I've written some of them out. Okay, so problem number one is, if child sacrifice is an abomination, why polemicize against it indirectly? In other words, why doesn't God say, stop? How could you do such an abomination? This is disgusting. I never wanted this. This is outrageous. But he doesn't say that. God says, wow, I am impressed. You ready to sacrifice your son? That makes me so happy. Now I know that you truly love me. You're my man, Abraham. Good man. That doesn't sound like he's horrified at child sacrifice. And it just, the main point is that God is happy. Aside from this, I would also say that the argument that this was just a test is something which can be questioned. What does it mean to say that it was just a test and he never really meant it? One could argue, and this is what I would argue, at least as an alternative possible reading, is that God did mean for Abraham to do it. He just chickened out at the end. He just, this was like, we're going to see who blinks first. And Abraham would have gone, and God blinked. And he said, no, don't do it, okay. But that doesn't mean that the test wasn't meant to be carried out. In other words, what I want to say is, when a test, by its nature, is determined by the question of whether a person does the deed or doesn't do the deed. If I ask somebody, climb up to the top of the Empire State Building, I want to see if you trust me. Climb up to the top and I want you to jump. And if you jump, that means you trust me. If you don't, it doesn't. Now, if that person climbs all the way up, I can't say, okay, now I know. When do I know that that person is a total fool? When they jump. If they go all the way up and they stand there, they haven't proved a thing. It's only if they jump. So when God says, slaughter the throat of your son and prove to me that you are obedient, there's only one way that Abraham can really pass the test, and that's by doing it. And so the whole idea that this is just a test, he didn't mean to, that Abraham should do it, to me it doesn't make sense. Until Abraham does it, he hasn't proven anything. Okay. This being the case, I believe we have to resort to other options in terms of interpretation. One of the things that is important to note in interpreting the story is that the condemnations of child sacrifice that are so prolific in much of biblical literature are not the only voice. And that there are biblical texts which give a clear indication, I believe, that at some early stage, and perhaps not only at the early stage, child sacrifice was deemed a legitimate form of the worship of the Israelite deity, Yud He Vav He, Yahweh. And that it was only the Deuteronomists, the priestly source, and others that dominated biblical literature, and they were the ones that condemned it, and they gave us the impression that the Bible and biblical Israel and all of Israelite religious culture was unified in the condemnation of this practice, when in fact that was an important position. Thank God that was an important position, saved lives, but I believe it was not the only position. And there are many indications, and I bring some of them on the bottom of page 2, that show that human sacrifice, as horrifying as it may seem, was actually something that certain groups not only did, but they did it not as worship to some Canaanite god, but as service to Yahweh. This is seen, for example, in Leviticus 27. I'm going to just read the bold. No person devoted made to destruction, yoharam, any person who is given in cherem, which is a type of vow, a type of sacred vow that one gives, devotes to God and makes it holy, cannot be ransomed. They are to be put to death. And that refers to, and the previous verse says, nothing that a person owns and devotes to the Lord, whether a human being or an animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted must be holy to the Lord. that's my house. If I devote it, it's temple owned. My animal, and if it's clean animal, if it's a pure animal, it's sacrificed. And my human property, usually, probably my slaves. Okay, those are all things that are part of my property which I can dedicate. And the text says, you can't redeem that. You can't say, I really like Joe, the carpenter, he fixed everything in my house, and I was angry and I devoted him to the Lord, and now I want to redeem. No, no redemption. Other things you can redeem if you just pay an extra fifth, but this is a special thing, no redemption. Another example, classic example, and I won't go into detail, is the story just above that in Judges 11. People are very familiar with this, so I don't have to detail it, but it's the story of Schechter. Is that how you say it? Schechter,
Yeah.
the judge who, before the battle, he made a vow. This is another case of a vow. And the vow was, the first thing that comes out of my house, oh Lord, if you give me victory, the first thing that comes out of my house to greet me when I come back, I'm sacrificing as a whole burnt offering to you. And of course, what is the first thing that comes out? His daughter. Okay, now here, I'm gonna say something, okay, I'm not gonna, I was gonna make a non-PC joke, but I'm gonna control myself. But the most important point is that some people say that he was expecting his dog or his sheep or his goat to come out, but the text clearly says the first thing that comes out of the doors of my house, sheep don't live in the doors of your house, to greet me in peace. Cows don't say moo, welcome back. That's only people, right? So he was planning on a human sacrifice from the very beginning. The only thing is, he thought it would be his mother-in-law. That's the joke, okay? But it was his daughter, and that's the tragedy. Okay, but human sacrifice is obviously considered legitimate because that text nowhere says any or expresses any form of condemnation for Jephthah's act. All the other, judges, if they worship Baal or do, some other illegitimate cultic things, the author is very clear and very negative. Here, not a word of criticism. Not a word of criticism. It's considered to be, apparently, the lesson is, be careful what you say. But once you say it, God took the bait. He promised God a really, really great sacrifice, and God said, okay, I will give you victory. And now you've got to give me my sacrifice. And that's what happened, and that is considered normative. Tragic, but normative. And there are many other examples which I'm not going to go into, except for the last one on the page where Jeremiah talks about human sacrifice in his day, and it says, and he says, they have built high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something that I did not command and that did not enter my mind. This is Yahweh speaking. So what we learn from this is Jeremiah's view of Yahweh. Yahweh says, it never dawned on me, I never commanded that you sacrifice children. But why is he saying that to the people that are sacrificing? Obviously because they believe that they are doing Yahweh's will. And he is saying, no, you're not. So what we have here is not an unequivocal condemnation that everybody agrees with, but something that Israelites debated. Some thought this is what God wants, and some thought this is an abomination. And apparently, in Jeremiah's time, it was seen more of an abomination, but in Jephthah's time, it was seen more as normative. And there are many other examples, which I won't go into. The point being that we should not assume when we go to the story of the binding of Isaac that the story must be condemning child sacrifice. That is to superimpose one view of child sacrifice onto the story. And the fact is that the God of that story never condemns Abraham for being willing to sacrifice his son. On the contrary, he praises him and is proud of Abraham for being willing to sacrifice his son. I haven't got to my main point yet, which is going to be a reconstruction of the story. How much
15 minutes.
Time?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. I just want to make one more point before going into a analysis of what I think is the original story. And this is the rather upsetting, I would have to say, depiction of God that we see here. The God who tests his chosen one. And the test is, I want to see you slaughter your son, your only son, the son that you love. Why? What is going on? Why this test? And I believe that the unavoidable answer is hinted at in other tests. If we look at some of the other tests in the Bible, we note that God often tests people that he chooses. In other words, his elect, his chosen beloved for his special treasure. Those are the people that he tests. And why does he test? Because God demands absolute, total adoration to the exclusion of all competition. If you look at the story of Job, for example, poor Job has to lose his entire wealth and all of his children, his 7 sons and his 3 daughters. And why? Because the Satan said, he doesn't really love you. You just gave him lots of wealth and a happy life. Does he really love you, God? And God starts wondering. I was so proud of Job. Maybe he doesn't love me all that much. Let's kill all his children and see what happens. And this, to a horrifying extent, I believe, is what's going on in the story of the Akedah. God loves Abraham, but he wants to know that he is number one. So first he says, listen, you got to chuck your parents. Dump them. Lose your parents. Got to totally dissociate yourself from your entire family. Just leave everything if you want to be mine. Then when he gets there, and he gives him one and only one child, he says, let me see that you really love me. Let me see that I am more beloved. Take that human being that you love more than anything else and slaughter him to me so that I know that you love me more than anything. That is the God that is referred to as a jealous God in other texts. He is jealous. He wants, in these cases, he wants to test people who he loves with tests of love. A test of love is to see if you really love me. If I kick the heck out of you, will you still love me? That's what God does. I know it's horrible.
We call it abuse.
We would call it abuse. Well, what would you call somebody who demands that you slaughter your child? It's an abuse of God. As far as I can see, I can't see any other way of interpreting it. However, that's just part one of what I wanted to present. What I really want to suggest is that there is behind all of this an original story which has been modified. And in order to see my reconstruction, you can look at page 3. So at page 3, you can see that it says Genesis 22, the original story, and everything that is in bold is what I believe is the supplements. Everything that is not in bold is what I consider to be an original story, the original story. What did this original story tell? Basically, it told the story of a man named Abraham who was tested, as we said. And the test was, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. What I believe is that in its original form, the story was not a part of the book of Genesis. It was an independent story, and it was not about Isaac. The son was identified with Isaac when it was brought into the book of Genesis. I know this is a lot, that I'm saying, but without basing, but I'll do my best. And in that original form, the child was indeed sacrificed, and the original ending was the second speech of the angel of the Lord. The second speech of the angel of the Lord, which starts in verse 15, and I'll read it to you. Verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. I don't believe that it was a second time. It was the only time. And said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Now let's listen to those words. Because you have done this thing. Yan asher asita et hadavar hazeh. Because you did, what did he do? He did it. And you have not held back your son from me. That sounds to me like he did it again. We, of course, say, oh, because you have done this means you almost did it. And you have not prevented your son means you were willing to not prevent it. But the text says, because you did this thing and did not prevent your son from me, therefore I will make you multiply, which is exactly what child sacrifice is about. Slaughter the first child, and God will reward you with many, many children. Show your faith by giving up the first fruit, whether it's the fruit of the tree, of the land, or of the womb, and you will get abundance. And this story, therefore, basically taught What is the source of Abraham's great proliferation? How is it that Abraham became the father of so many nations? He passed the great test. Another indication that this is so is verse 19. Verse 19 says, very significantly, then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. Somebody is missing. Okay? Then, especially if you look at verse 5. In verse 5, at the beginning, Abraham says to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and we will come back to you. He says, we will come back to you. Why does he say that? Why does he say that? Well, I think there's a very clear reason why he's saying that, even though he knows that he's going to sacrifice his son. Why does he say, we are going to come back? We're just going to worship and we're just going to bow down and then we're going to come back to you, servants. Stay right here. Because Isaac is listening. He doesn't want his sacrifice to run away. So he's got to say, we're just going to prostrate ourselves. We'll be right back. Just wait for us here. Then, of course, at the last second, he ties up the son and slaughters him. And therefore it says in verse 19, Abraham returned to his son. Not Abraham and Isaac returned to his son, because Isaac did not return. Now, this may sound a little extreme. However, in my defense, I would like to at least point out that on page 4, and I guess perhaps I'll end with this last point and then we can have a little discussion. There is the tradition of Iphigenia in the Greek tradition, with which I am far from being an expert. However, it's basically the story of, the Trojan War, and Agamemnon is set the 1,000 ships out to fight against Troy, but there are no winds for the ship. And what do you do when there are no winds for the ship? You slaughter an animal and look at its entrails. And so they gave that to Calchas, who was the seer, and he says, aha, Iphigenia, your daughter, Agamemnon, you once made an oath, and interestingly, it's an oath again. You made an oath that the most beautiful thing born that year shall be given as a sacrifice to Artemis, one of the goddesses. And what was the most beautiful thing born that year? Your daughter Iphigenia. And so you have to slaughter Iphigenia. And Agamemnon is very tormented because on the one hand it's his daughter, on the other hand, the priest says this is what you got to do, and we have a responsibility to go fight the war. So significantly, how do they get Iphigenia to come? They tell her she's going to marry Achilles. So the old trick of telling the future sacrifice that, it's all innocent. Come here, we're going to marry you off to Achilles, and then everything will be happy. When she gets there, basically, what's interesting is we have two versions of what happens. In one version, which is Euripides' version, at the very last minute, and this is in bold, but Artemis snatched me away the very last minute. And in my place on the altar, she put a deer and whisked Iphigenia off to live among the Taurians. However, in Aeschylus's play Agamemnon, the play ends with the words, I neither saw nor will tell what followed sacrifice. Calchas's prophecies have never failed. Such is the way of justice. In other words, one version tells the story of the sacrifice. Another version tells the story of the replacement of Iphigenia at the last second by the very goddess who is demanding the sacrifice. That goddess, Artemis, almost like can't see it through and saves Iphigenia and whisks her off, and then a whole new play can happen. My argument is that that is exactly what happened in Genesis. Once this story was put into the book of Genesis, the child had to be Isaac. And if the child is Isaac, the child has to be saved. A, because we want God to be a nicer guy. He's got to be soft, a little bit of a softie. And second, Isaac has got to survive because there's the whole rest of Genesis in which he plays a major role. And so the story in its final form tells us a kind of mixed message. On the one hand, God is proud of Abraham for being willing to sacrifice and slaughter his son, and that's a great thing for Abraham to be able to do it. On the other hand, God, in the end, isn't really want to see those things through, and he is somewhat ambivalent about child sacrifice, though certainly not opposed to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions.
Well, I was just wondering how old child sacrifices were normally, because it seems like he's quite an old child, like he's able to carry firewood and things. I mean, maybe with Agamemnon that answers my question there, but I guess I thought my reading of Moloch worship and that sort of thing was they would be like infants, quite young, and so whereas Isaac's a fair bit older, and that sort of disturbs that thing a little bit.
Right. So there apparently are different types of child sacrifice. Some kinds seem to be in response to a particular dire situation. It's not like, baby sacrifice is like as soon as the baby is born, you'll sacrifice them. What else are you gonna, if you're gonna give it to the temple, what's the temple gonna do with a baby? It's just a baby, so it's gonna be sacrificed right away. But if we're talking about not a standard sacrifice that's given all the time like a firstborn, but a situation, it depends on, when the dire situation comes up. If the dire situation comes and the child is 25, so, but interestingly, Iphigenia is a virgin. So it seems to be like, it's still, we're talking about a premarital stage, which.
She's old enough to shoot arrows as well, so
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Oh, well, she's old enough to get married.
She's old enough to get married. Maybe that's why.
Won't be.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments?
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify thanks for the paper, by the way. That was great. I really enjoyed that. Well presented too. So what I'm interested in is with the Schechter story. Are you saying that the approval of child sacrifice is an earlier version, or are you saying that still in the version of Judges as we have it now, it presents it as a positive thing? I wasn't quite clear on what you're arguing there.
My impression is that, well, Judges, the book of Judges, I assume, has various stages. So it's possible that in one of the stages, or one of latest stages of the book of Judges that says, you know, in those times there was no king and everybody did whatever they wanted. So that editor might have thought of Jephthah's sacrifice as an example of that. But basically, as far as I could see, the main editorial line of the book, you know, will critique just about every judge for wrongdoing. And I think it's very, you know, it's a glaring silence that there's no, you know, he did what was wrong in the eyes of God, or it's just not there. And there are many cases, like in Ecclesiastes, there's this thing about, you know, whatever you vow, you gotta do it. And if you don't wanna, you know, you don't wanna do it, just don't vow. But once you make that vow, you've gotta do it. So I think that it's basically, sees it as the basic editorial of the book of Judges seems to me to see it as normative. You know, perhaps a bit foolish on Jephthah's part. On the other hand, it seems to imply that that is what helped the victory. I mean, the Spirit of the Lord entered Jephthah, and the first thing he does is make the vow. So he is making that vow not with some, you know, demonic spirit or something. He's making that vow, which is clearly some kind of human sacrifice. He is doing that while he's moved by the Spirit of God. So I don't see any negative stuff there.
I'm just wondering, sorry, thanks for the talk. At what point in history do you think that this story was added to Genesis, and if so, why?
Yeah, so I think that it was added. I mean, I really don't know. That's the bottom line. I have no idea clearly, but there are certain hints. I think that it was whoever added it was a Jerusalem person, I believe, because part of, you know, when Abraham does sacrifice the animal that shows up, and I think that's part of the addition, there's an etiology, there's a name, that's why they call it this place till today Adonai Yireh, which is, you know, the Lord will provide, or the Lord will, whatever. It seems to be a reference to Jerusalem. So it seems to me to be a Jerusalem edition of the story. When that happened, I'm not sure, but I would guess pre-exilic times. Though some people may say otherwise, but I would guess, because the fact is that the story was put in there without any clear condemnation of child sacrifice. I think the authors of Deuteronomy would never have accepted this story. The authors of Deuteronomy, like, you know, are totally appalled by, they would never have entered such a book, such a story into a book of any, you know, of any canonical kind. And if we say that Deuteronomy was more or less towards the end of the First Temple period, I'm guessing that it was earlier than that. But that's a, you know, time is a tricky thing when it comes to, you know, dating texts. Yeah.
But there's some readings that suggest that Isaac at some point understands what's happening and cooperates with the intended sacrifice.
Right. There are readings like that. I don't agree with that. I think that the text is portraying Isaac as duped. It's more edifying, especially for religious readers who want to read either a Jesus kind of prototype here, or a Jewish parallel to Jesus, as somebody giving themselves over. And Jews, at least, have used the story of Isaac as a paradigm of martyrdom, especially when threatened by Christianity, which was like either convert to Christianity or die. And they said, well, Isaac went willingly, and so will I. So there's a lot of theological and historical reasons to read Isaac as going and knowing what he's doing, because that serves a lot of theological needs. But I don't think in the actual original, whatever, earlier meanings of the text, Isaac knows. And in fact, I don't think that Abraham knows, but he does say God will provide the animal, and God does provide the animal. So Abraham is sort of like, how shall we say, he's a prophet, and he doesn't, like you say something, he's a poet and he doesn't know it. Well, he was kind of like a prophet without knowing it. He said, oh, God will provide the ram, and sure enough, the ram comes, but that, again, is, I think, the later version of the story.
I've got a bit of a far-fetched question with Isaac. There's a theory by Cy Finkelstein, Ian, I know you don't jump in, that there were two, there was the northern story with Jacob and the southern story with Abraham, and that Isaac is sort of a creation of the writers of the Bible, or redactors, or whatever you want to say. And I'm not saying it's just when you said that you think that the name Isaac was put into the story, can you just sort of comment on that far-fetched question?
Well, okay. Let me just say why I think that it was added. I think it was added because Isaac, in fact, in the narrative of Genesis, is never an only son. In the story of Genesis, Isaac is born after Ishmael. So it doesn't really make sense for God to say to Abraham, sacrifice for me, take your son, your only son, this, what do you mean your only son? He has 2 children. And if he has only one son, that's only when Ishmael was around, before Isaac was born. But the story identifies it. In other words, it doesn't make sense. You can't say that it's Isaac and to say that he was the only son. So I think, therefore, that that's not the only reason, but that it was about an anonymous son who we don't have to know his name because he was slaughtered. He wasn't important. What's important is the result. I think, I don't believe that Isaac is a made-up character. I think that he is originally the father of Jacob. In other words, I understand there's a northern, but I would say that Abraham, in the earliest level, was not connected to Isaac. He was just Abraham and lots of children. And Isaac is the original father of Jacob. And when Abraham and Jacob were put together, Isaac, who was Jacob's father, became Abraham's son. But that's, I'm not sure about that either. Possible.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yes, John.
I'm wondering, sort of, in your view of this kind of construction of the story, why the editor, if I put myself in their shoes, wanting to make the story more palatable, didn't make it more obvious that God abhors child sacrifice. So, as you say, there's no kind of explicit rejection of it. So why would they not?
Because I believe that the editor did not think that child sacrifice was abhorrent. He may have, in other words, this story gave him the opportunity to present Abraham as a hero of religion. A hero of religion in the sense that he was willing to sacrifice his son. That's great in his view. He thinks that's great. But it is, he also has a little bit of a hard time with it. Because if you put it into the story and kill Isaac, then there's no continuation to Isaac, which doesn't make sense. So he's got to save Isaac. Plus, it's still, I think, a little bit of a nasty God. So we want to have a great Abraham and also a soft God. Abraham is great. He's willing to sacrifice. God is also not so nasty. He changes his mind and lets Isaac live. You get the best of both worlds, a good God and a good Abraham.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the story is conflicted because the editor himself is conflicted.
I think so,
Okay.
a bit, yeah. But not to the sense that it's to the degree that child sacrifice is abhorrent, is something that God, God can demand it, but he's also a nice guy, and he'll change his mind. Don't worry. Chances are.
Hey, thank you very much.
Don't tell it to Joe.